Hey everyone, authoritarian collectivism is wrong, it's immoral, no matter how you label it. And in Ukraine, that is now a recognized reality. So it appears Ukraine, that once did live under the communist regime, under communist rule, has now finally come to realize that just like their Nazi opponents or counterparts, the Soviets or the communist regime were every bit as much authoritarian or collectivist in their approach. And it's great to see a country such as Ukraine to actually recognize and acknowledge that in this very early portion of the 21st century. Headline out of the Foundation for Economic Education, Communism and Nazism are now legally synonymous in Ukraine. The ruling appears to pave the way for the removal of most of the remaining communist monuments and landmarks bearing Soviet names. It also prohibits the use of Nazi and communist symbols. It's been reported on July 27, 2019 by John Miltimore. Their names still haunt us: Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Auschwitz, Dachau, Majdanek. They stir images of the horrors of Nazi killing centers, where millions of Jews, Poles, Soviet POWs, and Gypsies were systematically killed in one of the great horrors of the 20th century. For many of us, this imagery is associated exclusively with Hitler and his Nazi minions. Such a view does not align with historical record, however. The Black Book of Communism, an international bestseller, reveals that the handiwork of 20th century communists more than matched the Nazis. In fact, a glance at the figures shows the communist death toll dwarfs the bloody work of the Nazis. In China, 65 million dead. In the Soviet Union, nearly 20 million. Vietnam, 1 million. Cambodia, 2 million. North Korea is 2 million and counting. Chalk up a few million more with Eastern Europe, 1 million, Africa, 1.7 million, and Afghanistan, 1.5 million. In all, communist regimes killed some 100 million people, roughly 4 times the number killed by the Nazis, making communism the most murderous ideology in human history. Mark Thiessen wrote in the Washington Post. And keep in mind, folks, it's not like the Washington Post is a right-wing publication by any stretch of the imagination. The different perceptions of the horrors of Nazi Germany to horrors of 20th century communism have long been a source of frustration for many who see cognitive dissonance in how the hammer and sickle is treated compared to the swastika. For lawmakers in Ukraine, this cognitive dissonance was apparently more than they could bear. In 2015, legislation was passed to make Nazism and communism legally synonymous. Last week, that law was upheld by a Ukrainian court. Wow, Eastern Europe are shown to be leaders and examples as far as finally acknowledging and recognizing that yes, authoritarian collectivism, like I say, regardless of the label you place upon it, it's not only immoral, but should be completely railed against. There should be no acceptance at all by anyone from either side of the political aisle or any area of the political spectrum that will accept an adoption of any form of authoritarian collectivism. Whether you want to call it communism, socialism, fascism, Nazism, authoritarianism, or collectivism of any stretch of the imagination should be completely denied outright by sheer fact that it's not just immoral, but wholly unethical in its approach. The fact that 100 million people had to die in the 20th century to prove that fact is a shame all on its own. Like I've said in many past videos and in many past incidents, in the age of information, ignorance truly is a choice. The communist regime, like the Nazi regime, inflicted irreparable damages to human rights because during its existence, it had total control over society and politically motivated persecutions and repressions, violated its international obligations and its own constitutions and laws, the court declared in a ruling published on its website. The ruling appears to pave the way for the removal of most of the remaining communist monuments and landmarks bearing Soviet names in Ukraine. It also prohibits the use of Nazi and communist symbols. Although I wouldn't necessarily say that it should be a good idea to remove these monuments or symbols. Just educate the people, right? You don't want to deny or remove history. That's actually a thing that I don't think is actually proper, because if you get far enough away from that, a few generations subsequent to that, then you can get people that will use political language to try to tell the people that no, they weren't bad at all, right? No, use that precedent. Use those monuments, use those symbols against authoritarian collectivism. You don't have to remove them. Just like I say, better educate and inform your people as to how detrimental authoritarian collectivism is to each and every one of them. That to me is more important than just trying to wipe the slate clean or try to deny history. I don't think that's a good approach, but hey, at the very least, the Ukrainian people are saying that they at least acknowledge that communism is a touchy subject in Ukraine should come as no surprise. As the Pulitzer Prize-winning author Anne Applebaum chronicled in her 2017 book, Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine, nearly 4 million Ukrainians died from starvation in the Soviet Union between 1931 and 1934. Applebaum makes it quite clear how this happened. The Soviet Union's disastrous decision to force peasants to give up their land and join collective farms, the eviction of kulaks, the wealthier peasants, from their homes, the chaos that followed, she writes, all was ultimately the responsibility of Joseph Stalin, the General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party. Millions of people starving is horrifying. What's more terrifying is that this policy was not accidental. As late as the summer of 1932, mass starvation appeared avoidable, Applebaum writes. The Soviets could have asked for international aid as they had in previous famines. It could have stopped exporting grain or halted grain requisitions. Party leaders chose not to. Instead, in the autumn of 1932, the Soviet Politburo, the elite leadership of the Soviet Communist Party, took a series of decisions that widened and deepened the famine in the Ukrainian countryside and at the same time prevented peasants from leaving the republic in search of food. At the height of the crisis, organized teams of policemen and party activists, motivated by hunger, fear, and a decade of hateful and conspiratorial rhetoric, entered peasant households and took everything edible: potatoes, beets, squash, beans, peas, anything in the oven and anything in the cupboard, farm animals and pets. As a result, 3.9 million Ukrainians died. In light of these horrors, it's no surprise that many in Ukraine, which suffered under Nazi rule the following decade, see little difference between the collective atrocities of the Nazis and the collective atrocities of the communists. Restricting speech. Before taking too much satisfaction in a nation equating communism and Nazism, however, the law in its entirety should be considered. As noted above, the legislation prohibits the use of Nazi and communist symbols. Violators of the law can be imprisoned. There's a great deal of free speech confusion today, especially in the U.S. Does it apply to people making wedding cakes? NFL quarterbacks not standing during the national anthem? Speakers invited to talk on college campuses? Conspiracy theorists on Twitter? Each of these issues is a topic worthy of discussion, but the fundamental purpose of free speech is to protect people from laws like Ukraine's. The First Amendment of the Bill of Rights say Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. That means the state won't put you in jail for saying something deemed verboten. Europe's crackdown on free expression is no secret. In fact, it's a trend many would like to bring to the United States. However, both Europeans and Americans would do well to consider two groups who would have enthusiastically supported state-imposed bans on undesired speech: Nazis and communists. That in itself should be enough to make us recognize the dangers of state bans on speech. Yes, we should never deny people's freedom of speech. But the fact that communism and Nazism are deemed as authoritarian collective ideologies and are presented as such, that I definitely agree with. But if this whole initiative, see, that's the thing that I didn't quite take from this article, but, well, until I got to the bottom of it. But yeah, if they're making it so that you can't even talk about these things, then that I definitely agree with. Freedom of speech is of paramount importance. And it's actually the only way that we can push back against these authoritarian collectivist ideologies is to have that kind of freedom of speech. So if what they're doing in Ukraine is actually preventing people from talking about these things, then that's actually a destruction of freedom and liberty. But I like the idea that they at least aligned communism with Nazism as far as being totalitarian, authoritarian, collectivist ideologies. That I definitely agree with. But if the people of the Ukraine, or this government of the Ukraine, is basically trying to suppress people's ability to even talk about or discuss these things, then yeah, then you're not doing any better, to be honest with you. You're actually, you're actually doing the exact same thing that the Nazis or the communists would have done, which is to try to silence or suppress people's ability to speak openly about these ideological premises or pretenses, right? So that I would definitely agree, especially, well, this is FEE after all, Foundation for Economic Education. So, I'm obviously a massive advocate of freedom of speech. I'm a free speech absolutist, basically, is how you would describe me, because I don't think speech is going to harm anyone. Other than, like I say, those few scenarios where you're talking about actually using preemptive violence towards someone or yelling fire in a movie theater or something. But even then, it's not the speech that's criminal. It's the fact that your speech has caused an action that caused harm, right? So there's a direct correlation there. It's not the speech per se. It's the correlation between the speech and the action. So it's actually, at the end of the day, it's the action that was the result of the speech is why yelling fire in a movie theater is deemed illegal, right? It's the action. But hey, if you yelled fire in a movie theater and nobody was harmed, well, you know what? That still shouldn't be deemed criminal. The only time a genuine crime should be considered to be committed is when there's an actual victim involved. That's the basis, that's the underlying fundamentals of English common law that has been built up and established over 8 centuries, folks, is yes, there has to be a victim in order for something to be deemed an actual crime. So there's a potential for crime based on speech as far as yelling fire in a crowded movie theater, but the speech all on its own isn't the actual crime. So while I agree with the premise, how this article started out, is saying that yet authoritarian collectivism, whether it comes under the banner of Nazism, fascism, communism, or socialism, they're all in the same category as far as denying the individual their inherent rights, freedoms, and liberties. So that I definitely agree with. But yes, trying to prevent people from being able to talk about it, write about it, or discuss it, that is something I definitely disagree with, because once again, I'm a major proponent of freedom of speech. So I guess this is kind of a positive, but I guess on the flip side of it, it's also a bit of a negative as well. But at the very least, the Ukrainian people are saying that they're, at the very least, what you can take away from this is they're at least acknowledging that authoritarian collectivism is something you never want to get behind or support. And in that area, and in that regard, I definitely agree. It's Canadian Libertarian, and I love liberty.